When you hear the words Mongol Empire, your brain probably cues up like the movie trailer version,
Oh,
right?
for sure. The massive hordes, the dust clouds on the horizon.
Exactly. Burning cities and just this raw, unbridled terror sweeping across a continent.
Right.
But reducing the Mongols to just, terror on horseback, it's, well, it's like looking at a magnificent centuries-old Gothic cathedral and saying, yeah, that's just some stone stacked up.
Yeah, you totally miss the underlying architecture.
You miss the engineering, the intent, and just the staggeringly complex system holding it all together.
And that system is what makes this history so critical to understand. The Mongol Empire was not a natural disaster. It was a highly deliberate, meticulously calibrated machine.
Right.
We're talking about a society forged in an almost unimaginably harsh, fragmented environment that somehow wrote the code for the largest contiguous land empire in human history.
Which is just wild.
It is. And they didn't do it simply by conquering blindly. They did it by becoming an unparalleled transcontinental operating system for a deeply divided world.
And that right there, that is the mission for this deep dive. We are taking the incredibly detailed notes you, the listener, shared with us, and we are deconstructing that exact operating system.
Yeah, looking roughly at the period from 1206, when the empire formally unified, to 1368, when the Yuan dynasty fell in China.
Right. But what makes your notes entirely unique and just so fascinating is the psychological framework you've applied to this timeline.
It's a really brilliant approach.
It really is. You've brought in this subpersonality reflection called Devon. And Devon is a psychological archetype defined by stoicism, isolation, structural precision, and the really heavy burden of consequence.
Yeah.
Your notes propose that the trajectory of the Mongol Empire actually mirrors this human psychological struggle. The struggle of a mind moving from pure survival and the darkness of its own destructive capabilities into building structure, and finally wrestling with the immense weight of power.
It is a brilliant way to anchor a massive historical sweep in, fundamental human psychology. But to understand how that Devon psychology formed on a societal level, we have to look at the crucible that forged it. We have to walk onto the factory floor where this machine was built.
The Eurasian steppe.
Exactly. Because to understand the mindset of the Mongols, you have to understand that this was not Egypt. This was not the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia.
Right. Think about the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates. Those are river valley civilizations. They are agrarian.
Yeah, the land stays still.
The land stays still. The crops grow in the same place every year, and society builds itself upward in fixed, predictable layers.
You get granaries, you build massive stone walls.
You develop temples, and you cultivate these incredibly dense stationary bureaucracies. The Mongol homeland in the eastern Eurasian steppe is the absolute antithesis of that. It is an ocean of grass.
An ocean of grass where the climate actively tries to kill you.
Literally. We are talking about freezing winters that plunge to 40 below zero, dry, blistering summers, very sparse forests, and severely limited options for any kind of settled agriculture.
The environment acts as a ruthless, unsentimental filter for human behavior. The steppe actively punished the exact things that settled civilizations relied upon.
I mean, if you attempted sedentary dependency, if you built a permanent wooden house and stayed in one place when a winter storm hit,
Or when a drought dried up the local grass, yeah.
your herds would die, and then you would starve. It's that simple.
The steppe punished weak logistics because moving thousands of animals and people requires absolute cellular coordination.
Right.
And perhaps most importantly for their political future, it punished vanity. It punished rigid hierarchies that relied on a purely inherited title rather than proven life-saving competence.
You just can't command a tribe simply by saying, well, I'm in charge because my grandfather was in charge.
Not if you don't actually know how to navigate to the hidden water sources during a drought.
Exactly. The steppe will literally kill you for that kind of arrogance. And your notes tie this directly into the Devon framework.
Yeah, describing Devon's baseline temperament as a fortress mentality.
A stoicism that isn't just an aesthetic choice, but a structural requirement for functioning in severe conditions. The steppe didn't tolerate softness that was detached from reality, and neither does that psychological subpersonality.
And that stoicism was built into every single hour of ordinary Mongol life. Their entire existence revolved around herds, horses, sheep, goats, cattle, camels.
Because their livelihood was alive and walking around, Their wealth was entirely portable. They didn't have vaults of gold or land deeds,
Wealth was a living, breathing asset that had to be defended 24 hours a day.
and they lived in gorders or yurts, which are, they're brilliantly engineered.
Oh, absolutely.
They're these aerodynamic felt structures that could be broken down in under an hour, packed onto a cart, and moved. Let's talk about the specific mechanics of that daily survival, because it's so alien to how we live now.
Yeah, their diet was built completely for mobility. They relied heavily on their herds without unnecessarily slaughtering them.
Right, they drank fermented mare's milk, called airag, which provided crucial vitamins.
And they dried meat into a jerky called borts.
Warts, yeah, which was light, practically never spoiled, and could be boiled in water to make a quick, high-protein broth right there on the march.
And childhood, it was virtually non-existent by modern standards.
Yeah, children were tied to the saddle practically before they could walk.
They were handed miniature bows to hunt marmots and birds. By the time a Mongol was a teenager, they possessed an environmental literacy that rivaled a modern special forces soldier.
That's a great comparison.
They could read the weather, navigate by the stars, and shoot an arrow with lethal accuracy from the back of a galloping horse.
The societal implication of that daily reality is massive. In a settled agrarian society, the military is a highly specialized profession. A king has to pull farmers away from their fields, hand them a spear they barely know how to use.
And then drag hundreds of wagons of grain behind them to keep them fed.
Right. And that baggage train moves at the speed of a walking ox. In Mongol society, the entire population was already mobilized.
The exact skills required for daily pastoral survival riding, long distances, hunting, organizing group movements.
Communicating across vast open spaces.
Yes, those are the precise skills needed for a military campaign.
I love the analogy we discussed earlier about agrarian empires being like a desktop computer. Rome, the Han Dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate, they are incredibly powerful. They process a massive amount of cultural and economic data, but they are plugged into the wall.
They are entirely anchored to their tax base, their capital city, and their stationary grain shipments.
Right. If a massive famine hits the capital, or if you cut their central supply line, the screen goes black. The empire crashes. But the Mongols were like a rugged, military-grade, solar-powered laptop.
That's perfect. They carried a civilization of motion. They were entirely self-contained.
A civilization of motion. Their soldiers carried their supply lines with them. A Mongol warrior typically traveled with a string of 3 to 5 remount horses, right?
Yeah. If one horse grew tired, he switched to another without stopping.
Which is incredible. And if they were trapped in a desert without water, they knew how to open a vein in their horse's neck, drink a small amount of blood for sustenance, close the vein, and keep riding.
They could cover 60 to 80 miles a day, every single day. Sedentary armies dragging those ox-drawn supply carts were lucky to cover 10 or 15 miles.
So the sheer operational tempo of the Mongols left sedentary generals completely paralyzed. But, I keep hitting a wall when I try to visualize the next step.
How so?
Well, a rugged laptop is great for surviving the wilderness. But how does a society of fiercely independent wandering herders actually build a unified empire? A civilization of motion, inherently, is just a bunch of scattered tribes violently bumping into each other over grazing rights.
Right, they are inherently decentralized.
Yeah, they hate being told what to do by outside clans. So how do you actually force them to network together and operate as one machine?
You are identifying the core vulnerability of the steppe right there. Historically, nomadic confederations would rise up, raid the borders of China or Persia, get bought off with silk and silver,
And then immediately fracture back into tribal infighting.
Exactly. To change that, someone had to completely rewrite the sociological code of the steppe. Someone had to break the old aristocratic loyalties.
And that architect was Temujin, the man the world would eventually call Genghis Khan.
And to understand Temujin, we really have to look at the trauma of his early life, because it directly informs the system he builds.
The steppe he was born into wasn't a peaceful, romantic camping ground. It was intensely violent.
It was a world of endemic blood feuds, cyclical wife-stealing, raids, and constantly shifting alliances.
And Temujin experienced the absolute worst of it. His early biography is a masterclass in psychological pressure.
Yeah, his father, a minor chieftain, was poisoned by a rival tribe when Temujin was just a boy.
And immediately, his father's followers abandoned the family. They didn't want to follow a child.
So Temujin, his mother, and his siblings were left to starve on the harsh steppe. They survived by eating roots and rodents.
Later, he was captured by a rival clan, forced into slavery, and made to wear that heavy wooden collar that restricted his movement.
He eventually escaped by hiding in a freezing river, breathing through a hollow reed. I mean, the resilience is staggering.
He learned very early, and through profound physical suffering, that the traditional steppe social structure was fundamentally broken.
Right, the old ways, where clans only followed their hereditary elites, merely perpetuated chaos and vulnerability.
So he essentially hacks the societal code. As he slowly builds his own following, he refuses to play by the traditional aristocratic rules.
When he defeats a rival tribe, the standard steppe practice was to kill the leaders, take their wealth, and perhaps keep the survivors as an underclass.
But Temujin does something entirely different. He systematically dismantles their tribal identity. He takes their warriors and scatters them among his own units.
He breaks the old loyalties and reorganizes power around a completely different metric: merit, absolute obedience, and direct service to him.
He was forging a new synthetic identity. You were no longer a Tatar or a Merkit or a Nayman. You were a Mongol.
Your rank in his new military machine wasn't determined by who your father was, but by how competent, how intensely loyal, and how effective you were.
The ultimate proof of this meritocracy is Subutai. The notes call him the Mind of War, which is an incredible title.
It really is. And Subutai was the son of a blacksmith. He wasn't steppe royalty.
In the old system, his ceiling would have been fixing horseshoes for a minor lord.
Exactly. But under Genghis Khan, he rises to become arguably one of the greatest military strategists in world history.
He orchestrates campaigns thousands of miles apart, coordinating armies with a precision that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century.
Subutai is the living proof that Genghis Khan's new operating system allowed supreme competence to rise to the top, regardless of birth.
But this restructuring wasn't just a military reshuffling, right? It required a total legal and spiritual overhaul to maintain discipline among these newly integrated tribes.
Which brings us to the Yasa. The Yasa was the new legal code, a body of rulings and norms that imposed stern order and predictable punishment.
What fascinates me about the Yasa is that the laws weren't arbitrary. They were hyper-focused on eliminating the specific behaviors that caused internal steppe conflict.
Yeah, it outlawed the kidnapping of women from other tribes, which was how Temujin's own mother was acquired and a major source of blood feuds.
It outlawed the theft of livestock. It established total religious freedom, which prevented holy wars between tribes that might practice different forms of shamanism or early Christianity.
It created a harsh but entirely consistent rule of law, and the predictability is the crucial mechanism here.
Right.
In a world defined by arbitrary, chaotic violence, the Yasa provided a baseline of internal stability. If you broke the law, the punishment was often death, but everyone knew exactly where the lines were drawn.
This allowed the Mongols to stop fighting each other and project their immense pent-up energy outward. And to legitimize this new, radical order, Genghis Khan utilized the spiritual framework of Tengri, the eternal blue sky.
But the notes make a very sharp, crucial distinction here about Tengri. We aren't talking about divine kingship in the way we see it in medieval Europe or ancient Egypt.
Yeah, there's no Pope of the Steppe crowning him. There's no massive, centralized priesthood controlling the narrative.
Tengrism was a shamanic cosmology centered on the sky, ancestral spirits, and harmony with nature. Genghis Khan's authority didn't stem from reading a sacred text.
It came from undeniable physical reality. His authority came from his personal charisma, his unprecedented military success, and his ability to distribute the spoils of war to his followers.
The spiritual aspect Tengri provided a sacred post facto legitimation.
Right, the logic was deeply pragmatic. I am winning spectacularly against impossible odds. Therefore, the eternal heaven must favor me.
My victories are the physical, cosmic proof of my mandate to rule the earth.
I won, so heaven obviously likes me. It's hard to argue with a man who has conquered everything in sight and attributes it to the sky.
Very true.
But your notes bring us back to the psychological parallel, and it is a stark one. Genghis Khan took isolated, traumatized, chaotic energy and forced it into a highly disciplined system.
The notes describe the Devon subpersonality transitioning from lone wolf to command structure.
Yeah. Devon finds meaning not by fleeing the harshness of the world, but by building a framework to manage it. Genghis Khan is the historical manifestation of that transition.
He is the architect building the framework. But here is where we must face the shadow of that architecture.
Yeah.
To build that framework to pacify the steppe and unify the tribes, Genghis Khan annihilated resistance with unimaginable bloodshed. He broke the old world to build the new one.
And this raises an incredibly uncomfortable historical truth. If stability emerges from calculated terror, if peace on the steppe only comes after systematic slaughter, how do we evaluate the architect?
It's the ultimate trap of history, trying to force figures like him into a modern binary of hero or villain.
The notes explicitly reject that binary as insufficient. I mean, if you lived in a city that resisted him, he is the harbinger of the apocalypse. He is unadulterated evil.
But if you look at it from the perspective of the steppe, he is the savior who finally stopped the endless cycle of clan violence and starvation.
The more rigorous analytical framework, the one your notes advocate for, is to ask, what problem was he trying to solve?
What exact constraints was he operating under?
Right. In a world where weakness invited extinction, his actions were not the irrational impulses of a madman. They were highly adaptive, deeply calculated responses to an unforgiving environment.
He built order through brutal force because, in his geopolitical reality, force was the only currency that purchased survival.
So he writes the code. He unifies the tribes in 1206. He institutes the Yasa. He builds this hyper-disciplined meritocracy. But a civilization of motion cannot simply sit still.
It has to expand.
Which brings us to a massive logistical hurdle. The steppe operating system is perfected. But how on earth did a bunch of nomadic herders conquer walled, heavily fortified, technologically advanced, sedentary civilizations? You cannot shoot an arrow through a 40-foot stone wall.
That is the exact friction point that stops almost every other nomadic incursion in history.
Historically, nomads raid the borders, extract some wealth, and retreat to the grasslands because they lack the engineering to take a fortified city.
The Mongols overcame this, and to understand how, we have to look at the granular mechanics of their military organization, which went far beyond just riding horses and shooting bows.
Let's break down the decimal system, because this is the bedrock of their command structure. They organize their army into units of 10, called an arban,
100 called a zun, 1,000 called a mingen, and 10,000 called a tumen.
To a modern listener, a base 10 military organization sounds incredibly basic, but in the 13th century, it was a revolution in command and control.
Contrast it with a European feudal army. A European king calls his banners. A dozen different dukes show up, bringing their own peasants.
They speak different regional dialects, they have different armor.
And the chain of command is a chaotic mess based entirely on who has the highest noble blood. If the king issues an order, it has to filter through a dozen massive egos before anything happens.
And half the time, the duke decides he doesn't want to charge because he doesn't like the guy commanding the flank next to him.
Exactly. The Mongol decimal system eliminated all of that friction. A general issues an order to the commander of a tumen, 10,000 men. That commander instantly relays it to his 10 mingim commanders,
Who relay it down to the hundreds and the tens.
because everyone shares the exact same training and the exact same step background, they can execute incredibly complex maneuvers.
They communicated across the battlefield without shouting, using a sophisticated system of black and white flags during the day and flaming arrows or lanterns at night.
They could orchestrate a feigned retreat, pretending to flee in panic, drawing the enemy out of formation for miles, and then, at a single flag signal, perfectly wheel their horses around and annihilate the disorganized pursuers.
That level of coordination requires next-level intelligence gathering. They didn't just rush blindly at a wall.
No, the notes emphasize that they fought with information as much as with weapons.
They used spies, merchants, and defectors to map the terrain, locate water sources, and deeply understand the internal political fractures of their enemies before they ever launched a campaign.
But that still doesn't answer the question of the stone walls. How did they actually break the cities?
This is where we see the true, terrifying genius of the Mongol Empire. Their greatest innovation was not a standalone invention like discovering gunpowder.
Their genius was aggressive, systemic integration.
Your notes use a phrase that just stops you in your tracks. Human expertise as imperial loot.
It is the most accurate description of their methodology. When the Mongols conquered a city, they didn't just plunder the silver and the silk. They systematically plundered the mines. They would gather the surviving population and sort them. They separated the artisans, the scribes, the administrators, and most importantly, the engineers from the general populace.
So if they marched into China and encountered massive fortified walls, they didn't waste Mongol lives trying to climb them.
No, they captured Chinese siege engineers. They forced them to build traction catapults, battering rams, and complex siege towers.
Then they integrated those engineers into their army and turn those weapons on the next city.
It's like a massive, violent corporate merger.
That's a profound way to look at it.
Yeah.
Think about how a modern tech conglomerate operates. They don't always invent the groundbreaking new software in-house.
Right.
They find a smaller startup that did. They execute a hostile takeover. They acquire the specialized talent, and then they integrate that technology into their massive global platform to scale it infinitely.
The Mongols did that with human knowledge. Later, when they invaded the Middle East, they encountered Muslim engineers who understood how to build the counterweight trebuchet.
A massive machine capable of hurling much heavier stones with devastating force.
The Mongols captured those engineers, brought them all the way back across Asia, and used them to smash the walls of the final strongholds in southern China.
They cross-pollinated the deadliest technologies of two different hemispheres.
And they scaled that integration rapidly because they also acquired and weaponized administrative infrastructure. The greatest example of this is the YAM system.
The YAM relay network. This is essentially a continental pony express, but the mechanics of it are staggering. Walk us through how a message actually traveled from a battlefield in Persia to the capital in Mongolia.
Well, the YAM was a vast network of relay stations strategically placed about a day's hard ride apart, roughly 20 to 30 miles, stretching across the entire empire. At its peak, there were thousands of these stations, stocked with hundreds of thousands of fresh horses, fodder, and supplies. The local populations were heavily taxed to maintain these stations. It was a massive logistical burden on the conquered subjects.
Right. And an official Mongol messenger carried a paisa, which was a tablet of silver or gold worn on the belt, engraved with the Khan's authority.
It was the ultimate VIP access pass. I am speaking with the voice of the Khan. Move out of my way.
Exactly. A messenger carrying a paisa would gallop into a station with a bell ringing on his horse to signal his approach.
The station master would have a fresh, saddled horse waiting. The messenger would literally leap from his exhausted horse onto the fresh one and keep riding without a moment's delay.
They rode through the night, through blizzards, through deserts. Using the YAM, critical military intelligence or imperial decrees could travel upwards of 200 miles a day.
In the 13th century.
Which is insane.
It meant that the great Khan sitting in Karakoram could coordinate grand strategy on multiple fronts simultaneously, receiving intelligence from Europe and China in a matter of weeks.
They took the mobility of the steppe and married it to the bureaucratic depth of the settled world. They adopted paper administration. They used Uyghur scribes to create a written script for the Mongol language.
They used Persian administrators to run taxation. They built a transcontinental machine.
But here's the wall they eventually hit. You can use this incredible integration engine to break any city. You can use a YAM to coordinate vast armies, but you can only loot a city once.
Yeah.
If your empire's entire economy relies on plundering and extracting tribute, you eventually run out of world to burn.
So how did they pivot? How did they transition from a raiding economy to an administrative one?
That pivot is the essence of their pragmatism. They realize that a flowing river of trade generates exponentially more wealth over time than a one-time sack of a city.
This realization births the famous Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. But peace in this context comes with a massive asterisk.
Oh, totally. It was stability enforced by the threat of absolute annihilation.
Precisely. Once they secured the vast overland trade routes connecting China to the Middle East and Europe, the Silk Road network, they aggressively policed it.
Under Mongol administration, a merchant caravan carrying spices, silk, and porcelain could travel from the Mediterranean all the way to Beijing with a level of safety that had not existed since the height of the Roman and Han empires centuries earlier.
They lowered local tolls to encourage volume. They provided armed escorts.
If a caravan was robbed, the local Mongol governor was held personally responsible to compensate the merchants, which strongly incentivized local authorities to violently eradicate banditry.
And this sheer calculating pragmatism extended to the most volatile subject of all religion.
As the empire exploded outward, they suddenly found themselves ruling over millions of Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, and Christians.
And their approach to this diversity is fascinating because it completely bucks the trend of medieval holy wars.
They instituted what the notes accurately describe as pragmatic religious pluralism. They basically patronized everyone.
What is vital to understand here is the underlying motivation. The notes are wonderfully blunt about this. We cannot project modern, liberal, enlightened sentimentality onto the Mongols.
Right. The text literally says, "Spare me that lazy anachronism."
It's a crucial warning. The Mongols were not holding interfaith dialogues because they believed in the inherent equal beauty of all spiritual paths.
It was pure, ruthless political calculus.
If you are a Mongol ruler sitting on a throne in China or Persia, you and your warriors are vastly outnumbered by your sedentary subjects.
You simply cannot survive by violently trying to force a niche step shamanism onto an ancient, deeply entrenched Islamic or Buddhist society. It would ignite endless, unwinnable rebellions.
So instead, they transformed religion into an instrument of governance.
They turned the priest into middle management.
That is exactly what they did. They exempted religious leaders, monks, imams, priests, rabbis from taxation and military service.
In exchange, the bargain was very simple. Keep your congregations docile, do not foment rebellion, and pray to whatever god you worship for the long life and success of the great Khan.
I don't care who you pray to, as long as you pray for me and your people pay their trade taxes on time.
This led to incredibly surreal scenes at the Mongol capital. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan monk who traveled to Karakoram, wrote about participating in formal theological debates hosted by the Khan.
You would have Catholic monks, Islamic scholars, and Buddhist lamas debating theology in front of a Mongol ruler who was essentially using it as intellectual entertainment,
while simultaneously gathering intelligence on the beliefs of his subjects. We also see this deep pragmatism in their social structures, particularly regarding the roles of women.
Yes, the position of elite Mongol women offers a stark contrast to many of the sedentary civilizations they conquered.
Because the society was rooted in a mobile pastoral reality, and because the men were frequently absent on military campaigns that could last for years, the women were required to manage the massive logistics of the camps.
Elite women governed large estates, negotiated high-level diplomacy, and exerted immense influence over succession disputes.
There were extended periods where the entire Mongol Empire was effectively governed by a female regent. Torajin Khatun, for example, ruled the empire for 5 years after the death of Ugadai Khan.
Sorgadhatani Beki navigated incredible political peril to ensure that all 4 of her sons became great Khans.
It wasn't modern egalitarianism, but it was substantial, undeniable, practical power born of necessity. So if we look at the whole picture, what does this all mean for the average person living under Mongol rule?
The notes highlight a very stark duality. The experience of the empire depended entirely on a simple binary, your utility and your submission.
If your city submitted without a fight, paid its taxes, and offered up its skilled labor, you were integrated. You could practice your religion, and you might experience unprecedented economic prosperity through the Pax Mongolica.
But if you resisted, or even if a neighboring city resisted, and the Mongol generals decided they needed to make a psychological example of you to terrify the region, the result was catastrophic.
Submission and integration, or resistance and absolute erasure. This brings us to the actual collisions.
Yeah.
We've talked about the architecture of the operating system, the yam, the yasa, the pragmatism. But history is made when that system violently collides with the rest of the world.
Let's look at the campaigns and the figures who actually executed this expansion, because they didn't just conquer territory, they permanently altered the trajectory of civilizations.
And the turning point, the campaign that proves the sheer scale of Mongol retaliation, is the war against the Khwarezmian Empire.
The Khwarezmian campaign in the early 13th century is a textbook example of the Mongol doctrine of interaction and consequence. It is crucial to note that Genghis Khan did not initially intend to conquer the Islamic world.
He sought lucrative trade relations. He sent a massive, incredibly wealthy caravan of merchants to Otrar, a border city of the Khwarezmian Empire, which encompassed modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan.
He extends an open hand for trade, and the local Khwarezmian governor, suspecting the merchants of being spies, or perhaps simply blinded by greed at the sight of the caravan's wealth, seizes the goods and slaughters the merchants.
It's an incredibly foolish provocation. But Genghis Khan, surprisingly, still tries diplomacy.
He does. He restrains his anger and sends a delegation of formal envoys to the Khwarezmian Shah, demanding that the governor be handed over for punishment.
And the Shah's response seals the fate of millions. The Shah executes the chief Mongol envoy and publicly humiliates the others by shaving their beards before sending them back to the steppe.
In the Mongol worldview, the person of an envoy was sacred. They were the voice of the Khan. To harm an envoy was the ultimate diplomatic sacrilege.
It was not a political insult. It was an existential threat to the cosmic order Genghis Khan had established. It demanded an absolute, overwhelming response.
Genghis Khan takes his army over 100,000 men and vanishes into the Kizilkum Desert, a route the Khwarezmians believed was completely impassable for a massive army.
He achieves total strategic surprise. And what follows isn't just a defeat, it is the systematic dismantling of an empire.
Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, which were the cultural and economic jewels of the Islamic world, are besieged and devastated.
The Mongols utilized psychological terror as a deliberate weapon. They would drive captured peasants ahead of their army to act as human shields and fill in the defensive moats of the next city.
The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire proved to the world that crossing the Mongols resulted in literal erasure from the map. And this policy of expansion and psychological dominance was carried forward and adapted by Genghis Khan's successors.
Your notes categorize several key figures who represent the different faces of this evolving machine. After Genghis comes his son, Ugadei Khan. The notes call Ugadei the system builder.
Right. If Genghis forged the sword, Ugadei built the sheath. Ugadei is the one who stops ruling purely from the saddle.
He establishes the first permanent imperial capital at Karakorum. He expands and formalizes the Yam relay system.
He takes the raw, chaotic energy of his father's conquests and starts institutionalizing it into a functional tax-gathering bureaucracy. He stabilizes the empire.
But when we look at the grandsons of Genghis Khan, the paths diverge wildly based on the environments they're trying to conquer. Let's look at Kublai Khan in the east.
Kublai Khan is categorized in your notes as the transformer. His immense, decades-long project is the conquest of the southern Song dynasty in China.
This was an entirely different logistical nightmare than the open steppes or the deserts of Persia. Southern China is a landscape of dense jungles, massive rivers, rice paddies, and heavily fortified cities.
The Mongols had to learn naval warfare, building massive fleets to fight on the Yangtze River.
And to rule the population once he conquers them, Kublai has to fundamentally transform himself. He shifts from being a pure steppe conqueror to a sedentary Chinese emperor.
He establishes the Yuan dynasty. He builds a new capital in what is now Beijing.
He adopts Chinese administrative rituals, wears imperial silk, and patronizes Buddhism and Taoism. He represents the ultimate adaptation, a foreign conqueror, realizing that he must integrate into the cultural operating system of the conquered to maintain legitimacy.
But that immense adaptation created a profound internal fracture. To the traditional Mongols back on the steppe, Kublai had become soft.
He'd abandoned the Yaza for a palace. He'd abandoned the Yasa for Chinese bureaucracy. He was viewed almost as a traitor to the civilization of motion.
Yet to the Chinese elites he ruled over, he would always be viewed as a barbarian outsider. Kublai represents the height of Mongol cultural synthesis, but also the beginning of its identity crisis.
Now, contrast Kublai's approach of adaptation with his brother, Hulagu Khan, who marched into the Middle East.
Hulagu. The notes call him the breaker of worlds.
If Kublai was the transformer trying to build a new system, Hulagu was the ultimate rupture of the old one. In 1258, Hulagu leads a massive Mongol army to the gates of Baghdad.
At the time, Baghdad was the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was one of the undisputed intellectual, cultural, and political centers of the globe.
It housed the House of Wisdom, a massive repository of human knowledge.
The siege and subsequent sack of Baghdad is one of the most traumatic, world-altering events in medieval history. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, arrogantly underestimated the Mongol threat and failed to adequately prepare the city's defenses.
When the city fell, the Mongols unleashed total destruction. They executed the Caliph. The Caliph legend says they rolled him in a carpet and trampled him with horses so that royal blood would not touch the earth, a steppe taboo.
The political authority of the Islamic world, which had stood for 5 centuries, was decapitated in a matter of days. The grand libraries were destroyed.
The historical accounts, whether literal or poetic, state that the Tigris River ran black with the ink of countless priceless manuscripts, and then red with the blood of the scholars.
This brings up that Devon psychological framework again, specifically what the notes call the shadow phase or the horns phase.
The notes say Devon's identity includes carrying darkness and studying guilt without fleeing from it. And the Mongol Empire's actions in Khwarezmia and Baghdad are the ultimate manifestation of that shadow.
The text says, if your library burns in Baghdad, you don't call the arsonist complex. It is pure, monstrous destruction.
But the notes challenge us to sit in the extreme discomfort of a historical paradox. We have to reconcile the Hulagu who burns the House of Wisdom with the Mongol system that simultaneously creates the safest trade network the world had ever seen.
It is the defining contradiction of the era. The Mongols did not discover the world. They violently forced the world into contact with itself.
Before the Mongol conquests, Eurasia was a collection of distinct, mostly isolated regional systems. Trade existed, but it passed through a dozen different middlemen, incredibly slowly and with great risk.
The Mongols smashed all those regional barriers with terrifying force. They created a single, continent-spanning system of coerced connectivity.
The journey of Marco Polo, the transfer of gunpowder technology from China to Europe, the flow of advanced Persian medical knowledge to the courts in Beijing, all of that vibrant, world-changing exchange is built directly on top of the ashes of cities like Baghdad and Samarkand.
It is a coerced connectivity built on terror, and it felt like an unstoppable force of nature until the year 1260, the Battle of Angelut.
Angelut is the moment the myth shatters. This takes place in the Levant, near the Sea of Galilee.
The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, led by Qautuz and his general Baybars, marches out to meet a Mongol detachment left behind by Hulagu.
And crucially, the Mamluks were largely composed of enslaved Turkic soldiers from the steppes. They understood Mongol cavalry tactics.
In a profound turn of events, the Mamluks utilized the classic Mongol feigned retreat. They drew the Mongol heavy cavalry into an ambush and defeated them in open battle.
They stopped the Mongol advance into North Africa, preserving Cairo as the new cultural heart of the Islamic world. But more importantly, Angelut proved the Mongols weren't supernatural demons sent from hell.
They were an army, a brilliant, terrifying army, but an army that could be out-tacticed and beaten.
Which brings us back to the psychological parallel that anchors your notes. We've examined the history, the logistics, the horrors, and the achievements.
But your notes ask us to look at this vast historical canvas as a mirror for the Devon subpersonality. Devon is defined by discipline, introspection, a burdened moral seriousness, and a narrative of taking destructive strength and redirecting it toward integrity and protection.
The text is incredibly careful to make a distinction here. This isn't some superficial, edgy comparison saying, oh, the Mongols were tough warriors and Devon is a tough guy.
No, the resemblance is deeply structural. It is about how an entity, whether a transcontinental empire or an individual human psyche, processes and functions under severe, prolonged pressure.
Let's trace those specific structural parallels. We began with the steppe ecology. The steppe demanded hard survival. It did not tolerate illusions or softness detached from reality.
The notes state that Devon's temperament matches this perfectly. Devon isn't merely harsh for the sake of being harsh. He is fundamentally built to function in severe conditions without disintegrating.
And how did the Mongols survive that severity? Through precision over chaos. When we discuss the decimal military organization, the highly coordinated maneuvers, the flawless logistics of the YAM relay system, that is the historical manifestation of Devon's analytical tactical structure.
The notes describe Devon as the redeemed strategist, a figure of cold logic and long-range consequence. The Mongol Empire took raw, chaotic tribal violence and converted it into a disciplined, functional system.
Under intense pressure, Devon doesn't produce panic, flourish, or noise. He produces a system.
But then we confront the shadow without denial. Devon carries the weight of past destructive actions without letting them entirely define him. He studies his guilt.
The Mongol campaigns in Khwarezmia and Baghdad represent the unchecked, darker half of this pattern, what the notes call the horns phase.
It is the confrontation with what immense, efficient power does when it is severed from moral restraint or the necessity of repair. The Mongols did not sanitize their terror. They weaponized it explicitly.
But the parallel deepens, because the Mongols didn't remain solely a force of destruction. They transitioned. They moved from the devastation of the conquest to building and enforcing the Pax Mongolica.
They became organizers, protectors of the trade routes, administrators who had to figure out how to build after they had broken the world.
That trajectory from an isolated, purely destructive force toward discipline, responsibility, and systemic protection is exactly the psychological arc of Devon.
The notes refer to this as moving from lone wolf to command structure. When Genghis Khan took those scattered, violent tribes and forged them into a coordinated, unified mission, it mirrored Devon's internal shift from fortress to framework.
It is the psychological journey from mere survival and isolation into actual meaning and chosen responsibility. You can even map the different faces of the Devon subpersonality onto the historical Khans we discussed.
The text makes this explicit. Genghis Khan is Devon without restraint. Pure, unyielding force bringing absolute order out of chaos.
Subutai is Devon as pure, system-flawless competence, tactical execution, completely devoid of emotion.
Kublai Khan is Devon learning to adapt, struggling to build something sustainable and legitimate in a completely new, unfamiliar environment.
And Huligu is Devon when the shadow runs entirely unchecked destructive power, violently decapitating an entire civilization.
But woven into this psychological mapping is a profound cautionary warning. The notes state that strength without moral integration inevitably becomes a monstrosity.
True redemption, or long-term sustainability, requires accountability, not just brutal efficiency. The Mongol Empire is the ultimate historical testament to what astonishing discipline can achieve when fused with ambition.
But it also stands as a monument to the terrible lasting damage that occurs when power drastically outpaces conscience.
It's the ultimate cost of order. The notes say the Mongol Empire and Devon are both studies in what survives the cold. First you apply force, then you build order, and finally, you are left with the existential question of what kind of entity you become after you've won.
And that question, what happens after you've conquered the world, leads us to the final collapse of this operating system.
Because if this machine was so perfectly adaptable, so fiercely disciplined, so brilliant at integrating technology, why didn't it last? What finally breaks a system that was designed to survive anything?
It wasn't one single catastrophic battlefield defeat. It was a slow convergence of massive systemic pressures that finally exploited the structural flaws in their architecture.
First and foremost was the succession problem. Despite all their bureaucratic innovations, they never developed a clear, peaceful, institutionalized system for the transfer of supreme power.
Every time a great Khan died, the entire empire effectively hit pause. The generals and princes had to abandon their campaigns and rush thousands of miles back to Mongolia for a Kurultai, a political council, to elect the next leader.
This led to bitter, violent factionalism and civil wars. That constant stutter step eroded their momentum.
Then there was the sheer reality of overexpansion. They had stretched the rubber band as far as it could geometrically go across the globe.
They were attempting to govern an impossibly vast landmass, from the snowy forests of Russia to the jungles of Vietnam, managing incredibly diverse populations.
Even with the speed of the YAM system, the communication lines were strained to the breaking point. It simply became too expensive, too slow, and too complex to govern half the known world from a single political center.
But the most subtle, the most ironic, and ultimately the most fatal failure was cultural assimilation. Which is wild because their ability to adapt and integrate was their greatest strength.
Exactly. It was a fatal double-edged sword. To effectively rule the sedentary populations they conquered, the Mongol rulers had to adopt the local customs.
To maintain legitimacy in China, the Yuan dynasty rulers became culturally Chinese. They lost their step edge.
To rule Persia, the Ilkhanate converted to Islam and adopted Persian administrative and cultural norms. To manage the vast steppes of Russia, the Golden Horde intermarried with local Turkic peoples and adopted their language.
They adapted so perfectly to their specific regional environments that they ceased to share a unified Mongol identity. The transcontinental operating system fractured into localized, competing hard drives.
And then nature delivered the final, devastating irony, the Pax Mongolica. They built this incredibly safe, highly efficient transcontinental highway system to move silk, spices, and ideas with unprecedented speed.
But the exact same trade networks that moved a merchant from Italy to Beijing also moved fleas. They moved the plague.
The Black Death. The brilliant connective tissue of the Mongol Empire became the biological vector for one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history.
The plague, likely originating in the steppes and carried by fleas on marmots, moved rapidly along the Yam and the caravan routes.
It devastated populations across Eurasia in the mid-14th century. It annihilated their tax base, utterly disrupted the trade networks they relied upon for wealth, weakened central military authority, and triggered widespread economic collapse.
The very system they engineered to sustain their global dominance became the mechanism of their own unraveling. And that economic and demographic collapse triggers the rebellions.
In China, the Red Turban Rebellion violently overthrows the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1368, driving them back to the steppes and establishing the Ming dynasty.
In the Middle East, the Ilkhanate collapses under its own weight into competing regional Islamic states.
In Eastern Europe, the weakening of the Golden Horde eventually paves the way for a small tributary state called Muscovy to rise up, throw off the Mongol yoke, and eventually become the Russian Empire. The empire shatters.
And this brings the psychological parallel of your notes to its final conclusion. The Mongols were exceptional at conquering systems.
They could break any wall, defeat any army, and ruthlessly adopt any technology.
But they could not become one cohesive, long-term, self-sustaining system themselves. They built an awe-inspiring network of dominance, but they never solved the fundamental problem of how to maintain long-term political unity without resorting to constant, exhausting force.
My takeaway here, tying it directly back to the Devon reflection, is that this entire history is a massive cautionary tale about balance.
On one side, too much rigid control, enforced by terror and violence, eventually exhausts your resources and becomes unsustainable.
But on the other side, too much expansion, adapting to too many different environments at once, completely fractures your core identity.
The Mongols were brilliant at the first half of the equation, surviving the cold, moving from isolation to immense structure, and forcing connection. But they failed the second half, sustaining that connection without losing themselves.
They mastered human interaction through the application of absolute power, but they never quite evolved to master interaction through intentional restraint, empathy, and sustainable cooperation.
We have covered an immense expanse of history and psychology today. We've explored an empire born in the freezing cold, hardened by tribal violence, and organized by a ruthless genius into a transcontinental machine of coerced connectivity.
They didn't discover the world. They violently, brilliantly forced the world into contact with itself. They shattered older, stagnant systems and integrated the pieces to scale their own dominance.
And as we close this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final, lingering question drawn directly from the most profound insight in your notes.
The text points out that interaction exists on a spectrum between total domination and willing cooperation.
The Mongols mastered interaction through pure power. They tested the boundaries, escalated violence quickly, respected cold competence, and annihilated anything that threatened their stability.
But your reflections on the mature, evolved form of the Devon subpersonality point toward a different path connection, moral accountability, and intentional restraint, not just raw dominance.
So as you process this history, ask yourself, what breaks first? A system that is too rigid, holding on to absolute control so tightly that it eventually shatters under the pressure of its own weight.
Or a system that is too fragmented, adapting so readily to every new environment that it completely loses its core identity.
And perhaps the most important question to carry with you, as you navigate your own internal conflicts, your own psychological winters, and your own growth, what kind of system are you trying to become?
That is the ultimate question for any architect, whether of an empire or a mind.
It truly is. Thank you so much for sharing these incredibly layered, provocative notes with us. They took a subject we thought we knew, the tired movie cliché of the screaming horse archer, and proved that the Mongol Empire wasn't just some stone stacked up.
It was a staggering, complex, deeply flawed, but awe-inspiring cathedral of human adaptation.
Keep exploring those deep structural truths, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.